You're listening to Win Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.
And welcome to the Win Win podcast. This is Ben Wolf. As always, your host. We're going to be talking today about scaling a global business, 10xing a global business, and all of the different elements that go into that operationally, culturally, core values wise, all different aspects. And so we're going to get into that with our guest today, who is a highly experienced executive, a member of our team at my company, Wolf's Edge Integrators, Pete Palermo. Welcome, Pete.
Hi there, Ben. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Looking forward to this conversation. And I would like for everybody listening or watching to have a little context into what we're talking today by just hearing a little of your story. Like, you just give us like a quick 2-minute background on like where you came from, how you got here, who you are.
That's okay. We'll compress it all into 2 minutes.
Yeah,
I
no
think
problem, right? No
yeah,
problem at all.
I know. I think what what you don't see in my resume is my super intense curiosity about what makes people tick and how organizations thrive. And so, my journey really started working in consumer packaged goods in a Fortune 25 company. uh, in a sales and marketing role, transitioned to operations, worked on the domestic side initially, but spent about 5 years in the international aspect of that business and gained a real appreciation for how different things work across regions, cultures, languages, time zones. And I've leveraged that throughout my career. Transitioned from working in a big company to consulting to many small companies that were transforming their businesses in the early 2000s. And a lot of that transformation included moving their businesses, parts of their business outside of the country, whether it was manufacturing or selling to new customers. And at the end of the day, it really boils down to people where I started. What makes people tick and how it's different from region to region.
Well, there's a lot of a lot of angles obviously that we could explore on this, but maybe first we'll start there with sort of the cultural. And I guess one of the things I think about is what Reed Hastings said in his book Netflix Rules, or Netflix No Rules Rules. Excuse me, got to say that correctly. And uh and some of the international aspect of that, where they had a very specific culture about telling the truth and like extreme frankness, both up and down within the organization, and how that is very antithetical to many cultures around the world. And so, how do you maintain the culture of a business when the culture of the business, which may have a particularly American tint to it,
Mm.
may be inherently very different from the prevailing culture of most people in certain other countries or other parts of the world. So I'm just curious, how have you seen and how do you see that people should approach culture, or maintaining company culture when, obviously there's ups and downs, there's pros and cons of fully internationalizing that.
Mhm.
But how have you approached that? What have you seen when it comes to maintaining a culture and core values across a business where there are such different cultures, like you pointed out?
Yeah. Well, I'm smiling because I think the first step is understanding that there are differences, and the differences are not superficial. They're generations old. They're, deeply embedded in, um, you know, how people are taught and trained and how they learn from one another in each of the regions. So first it's, admitting, call it admitting that you have a problem, but admitting that there's something different there and that a different approach might need to be taken when working with even European cultures, which are very westernized, but not necessarily American. And then as you move around the globe, it changes even more dramatically, especially when you get to Asia. And even within Asia, there's lots of differences. But I'll tell you a quick one. In the 1970s, when a lot of American-based multinationals set out to do business in other regions of the world, instead of hiring local teams, they would actually send Americans to almost like missionaries to each of these countries and sought to establish the U.S. based culture in other countries. And frankly, that didn't work. You ended up with a lot of challenges with between the workers on the front line and management that came in as Americans who seemed to know everything. And over time, that has transitioned, and most multinational companies now empower local teams, and because they want to be sure that they're focused on the culture. I think that's really the first thing is that it's got to be local. And just like any organization and any individual that you work with, if we establish the goals and we refrain from telling people how to achieve those goals, but we work with the individuals who are responsible for achieving the goals, you're much more likely to have success. And as in one of my roles, I had responsibility for a commercialization team in Japan and a manufacturing team in China. Everybody had to work together, and the cultures are very different. And I had to learn firsthand that what worked well with my Japanese team did not work well at all with the Chinese team. And it wasn't better or worse. It was just different, and how
Well, can you say more about
collaborate.
that example? Like
I
what
think
was
it's
like in what way, what were you trying to accomplish and in what way was it different in Japan versus China?
that's a good question. So in Japan, we were working on commercializing new technology, and what we found was when there were challenges, and the Japanese team would tell us that it was not possible to achieve the objective given what we were trying to accomplish. Um, the dialogue and the more rudimentary, call it argument, could not be held in a big group setting. It had to be held one on one. And
Hmm.
in our culture, we would just
Because
hash
otherwise
it
they would
out.
be like in public, they would have to say yes, 100%, no problem.
Exactly.
But they can only tell you that's impossible in private
That's
because
exactly
that
right.
was the norm of the culture.
The norm of the culture was like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, we can do that. And then you find out it's not going to happen. And it doesn't happen. And you wonder, why didn't that happen? We all agreed that it was going to happen. It's like, well, yes really didn't mean yes in that setting. But if you had the conversation one on one with the senior executive, then the truth probably would have come out a little bit easier. Whereas in our culture, we're very comfortable having a knockdown, drag out, blowout argument, and everybody walks out friends. And we don't have to save face.
And what about in China?
So in China, China's a little bit more like where we are,
Hmm.
except that everything was yes. We can do everything, even though sometimes there wasn't the same level of confidence that the objective could be met. They would just hope that they could figure it out. So it was just it's a different mindset, different way of doing things. I found that the in the Chinese culture, at least that we were exposed to, it's much more aggressive, much more ambitious, not nearly as conservative as
Hmm.
working in the Chinese culture or the Japanese culture.
Hmm. One of the things when I think about that story from the Japanese team about a certain objective not being possible, one of the things that makes me think of is now, I don't know if this is similar between Japan and Europe, but one of the differences that I've come to understand between American culture and many European countries' culture, particularly look at like Germany or like England or other places, and there is not maybe as there is in China and in America a kind of maybe a just a not an entrepreneurial culture. And so it's just more conservative in the sense that maybe things are possible, but people just can't see it. Like, so
Hmm.
we could paint an outcome, and maybe your team says, "Hey, this is not possible," but maybe they're just not thinking creatively enough about the possibilities or the possible ways that this could happen. I don't know. Like, is that ever been something that you've had experience with? Is showing, I guess, showing people that that there possibly is a way, or helping them figure out the way that something could be done that maybe initially, maybe it was just closed-mindedness or lack of creativity that was making a person see a lack of potential to achieve something. Or am
I
I
think
off?
so. Europe in many ways is conservative for a lot of reasons, and one is that there's not the incentives don't exist for the Elon Musks of the world to to pop up and thrive, right? Like there's no low in Europe in many European countries, and there's no high highs, just the way the way things are structured. But I think if you look at Asia, um, Japan is more conservative, and I think the workers are more conservative because there's still a very much a top-down organization structure and workflow. So I'm going to get my instructions, I'm going to get my inspiration from the leader of the organization, and I'm just going to do, I don't mean to say it in such a like a narrow way, but like I'm going to do what I'm expected to do. And that's it. And not that I don't want to do more, but like this is what I'm expected to do. This is my role. Whereas if you go to China, it's just more ambitious, more entrepreneurial, a very much higher tolerance for risk taking. And I think
Mhm.
that's, if you go back to Europe, that's part of the challenge there is that there's the tolerance for risk is not nearly as high as it even might be in the US.
Well, how do you, I guess when you want to achieve that growth mindset, you want to make your business more entrepreneurial, you're looking to expand, you want to expand globally. How do you or how have you found that one can implement that kind of like a 10x mindset, or a growth, or maybe a more aggressive growth and improvement and iteration mindset in an international organization where you do have these I don't know, where you have these differences in culture or whatnot. But how do we, or how have you found that you can have a growth oriented, or an ambitious growth oriented business uh, on an international scale? How have you found that one can do that?
I think it boils down to ensuring that you have the right people in those roles. And you go back to my example of 1970s when we would send American, call them missionaries to foreign countries. It's hiring the right people who have that mindset, who want to be entrepreneurial, want to be more aggressive, want to innovate and stake a claim for themselves in their culture and in their communities. And oftentimes, we start out with an organization especially when we inherit an organization, but we start out with an organization that may not share those values. And
Hmm.
the folks in China, Japan, parts of Europe, other parts of Asia. I think you have to have the right people. And it's interesting, you think about working for an American company in Japan or China. In some decades, it's very prestigious to work for an American company, and in other decades, it's not. And so you just have to find the right people that are willing to do the kinds of things that need to be done in order to drive that. And then after that, it's changing the mindset of an individual to think incrementality is not the way to success here. We need to think in more of a revolutionary way so that we can conquer more territory, so that we can gain more, whatever it is, market share, what have you.
What what mistakes have you seen? You mentioned one about companies in the 70s and taking much more of a top down, or a missionary style when it comes to just kind of like forcing down American culture, or at least attempting to. You mentioned that mistake. What other mistake or mistakes have you seen people who are trying to scale, or that you've made, maybe in any of the businesses where you've been in or you've seen, um, where where there's a mistake? Somebody's trying to scale 10x, grow a business, doing that within in an international way. What sort of mistakes have you seen? What other mistakes have you seen people make, or have you made maybe in the past?
So if you ask my partners and colleagues who I've worked with in the past, I think they would tell you they tell you two things. One is the probably the biggest mistake that I made is I didn't spend enough time really getting to know the individuals and getting to know the organization in each of those countries so that I could identify the differences and better understand how that I needed to work differently with these teams, just like we do with our own teams. We think about our own teams, we don't treat everyone on our teams in the same way.
Mhm.
It's that taking that mindset and applying that to like a bigger picture cultural perspective where we have to that's the norm is to that I have to change my behavior, I have to change the way I interact. I have to spend more time building credibility and relationships with the teams. When I didn't do that, I showed up as a cowboy, gunslinger. I'm ready to go. I've got all the right answers. This worked back where I came from, so it's going to work here. And that didn't work, right? That set me back.
Well, what are some examples of ways that when you did start to listen more or pay attention more about how to work differently with different teams than what you were used to? What were some of those differences that came out of that?
I think that the biggest I'll say it from this perspective that as I better understood the culture, as I better understood how things worked in those organizations and those teams, and how people were raised, call it raised in the business environment, I found that instead of it being a one-way conversation, me telling, it became much more of a two-way dialogue. And by the end of 2 or 3 years, and which it really did take several years, there was more of a proactive approach from their perspective. And I found that the team was, you know, um, sharing ideas without being asked, because they knew that it was a safe environment. There was no downside to sharing an idea. And I think at first they were very reluctant to share anything that might make them look like they didn't have the complete answer or that it was going to be a different answer than what we would have expected.
Mhm.
I think the other thing that you asked about the other challenges that we faced. The other thing was not only what products we were selling in each of the different regions around the world, but how we were marketing those products. There
Mhm.
became a very big difference in how we designed product, and we were selling digital cameras at the time,
Mhm.
how we designed products, how we marketed those products, who we associated with to sell in those regions. And there's lots of different competitive challenges that you face as an American company in other regions, but also the constituents that are going to be buying from you have a different mindset for how they make decisions about purchases.
Right. No assumptions. I don't know if it's apocryphal, that story about, again, I don't know if it's apocryphal, if it's true that they were selling Gerber baby food in a certain country and it wasn't selling
Hmm.
there. And they, you know what I'm talking about?
I
And
do,
that,
yeah.
yeah, that, I don't know, in that culture, they would put they always had pictures of the food on
Hmm.
on the food. And they had a baby on a bottle of food. It just looked like it was like
Is there a
actually
baby
eating
in
a
there?
baby.
Right.
Like so that
Yeah.
no one would buy. It looks disgusting. No one would buy such a thing.
Well,
Like,
or is there a baby in there? Like, well,
right.
yeah. So yes, it's almost like I think about it as you're not quite starting from scratch, but the paper needs to be fairly clean when expanding into other countries, because you can't take the assumptions that we have in the US and apply them one for one, literally,
Right.
to what you might expect to see in another country.
What kind of business, let's say American based businesses founded in America, what kinds, what kinds of situations are ones where, as in your experience in being in this space for a long time, where international expansion is a good idea, and for whom would it be not a good idea?
Hmm. I think it's always a good idea. So there's always going to be an opportunity, no matter what products or services you sell, there's going to be an opportunity in every region. We're such a global economy that, the differences today, are minute compared to the differences even 20 or 30 years ago, between cultures and economies and the structure of their economies. So there's always going to be a place for those products and services. I think it really boils down to, do we have the right solution for that particular community? And can we restructure, reorganize? Can we shape what we have to make it make sense from a product feature benefit perspective, from a pricing perspective, from a business model perspective? I think a lot of all of that, you think about, you have to start with that almost clean sheet of paper. Who is the customer? What are they buying from us? How do they buy? How do they make decisions? And then how do we execute that in that country? Do we manufacture locally? Do we ship in from the US or another country? How do you do all that? I think it's all doable. It's just a matter of shaping the offering, shaping the go-to-market strategy so that it's appropriate and it feels like it's relevant to that community of that country.
And look, obviously, certainly, if somebody is, we at Wolfside Integrators, we're at a place where if someone needs a number two leader, COO, integrator, whatever you want to call it, and they have an international business or a business they want to make international, obviously, having someone like you on the team, among other reasons, would be very, very beneficial with them. But hoping that people can get the benefit right now from listening to or watching this. As a final question, um, what is something, what's like one or, someone's considering having their business go international, start going into at least the first or second additional country or language. What, what's a one or two most important piece of advice someone's like thinking about or going in this direction? What would you tell them? What's the biggest one or two pieces of advice that you want to make sure they know, and maybe you wish somebody would have told you years ago if
Mhm.
you were going into this, like what do they need to hear from you?
I think that there's probably a handful of things that would first start out with why. Why are you doing that? Why is it necessary for your company to trade in another country? You mentioned language, which I hadn't mentioned before. There's a whole set of challenges when it comes to language. So it's not just culture, it's not business practice, it's language as well. And so start out with why. What's the value? What are you going to do for that market that someone isn't already doing? Because it is going to be a risk. And what's your tolerance for risk? But it's a risk. It's an expense. It's a longer term payoff. So one, why are we going to do that? And then two, I would say, it's sort of like a go slow to go fast mindset. What is the culture? What is the product? What is the service? What will be embraced and what won't be? Can we be successful and profitable in that other country, just like we are in the US. So I think that's where I would start. Why are we doing this, and what's it going to look like to be profitable in one or another countries? I think the other thing I
Right.
would think about, Ben, is how much of the value chain needs to be executed in that local market. So should we manufacture in that local market? Because we have to build credibility. And there's no quicker way to build credibility than to manufacture locally and source raw materials locally, source human resources locally. So that may end up becoming a factor depending on the product or service that somebody's offering.
Right. And where to, and also if you're if you're an international buyer, maybe your business even is in America, but you're an international buyer. I was talking to people recently, um, who them and everybody else in their industry, which was the wine and liquor industry, um, is in full blown panic mode about the incoming presidential administration in
Hmm.
America and potential tariffs coming in. And that, they're not limited to China or anything like, but all over the, potentially all over the country. And they have a product that you can't just sell, Californian wine if somebody wants French wine. Like
Hmm.
it's not fungible. Like like it's
Right.
they're all like they're just not going to buy the wine at all. Like and so or at least in some instances. So it's just another interesting factor is to think about political factors
Hmm.
when it comes to international business and risks of potential tariffs in one direction or the other. I guess that also comes into it. Maybe if you manufacture locally, maybe you could avoid those tariffs. I don't know. I don't know the rules on these things, but as they say, I would imagine that that's a factor to think about also.
Every industry has like a whole set of tariffing duties, rules for sure. I'll give you an example. We in another business, we manufactured textiles. So we were making t-shirts and shorts for, gym shorts and that kind of thing, that we wanted to outsource. We were making them in Mexico at the time, and we needed to move them somewhere where it was even less expensive. So we looked at Haiti. And Haiti 10 years ago was a great idea, like an amazing idea. There was the Hope Treaty, which eliminated tariffs on product that was being produced in Haiti and shipped to the United States. It was very favorable. There was a very significant appetite to have investment in Haiti from the U.S. So we opened a factory there, and there's challenges always, right? But there was a lot of benefits for a few years, and then the political landscape changed. There was a revolution. Like now, you can't even go to Haiti, but there was
Hmm.
a revolution, and we lost the factory.
Oh,
Like lost control of the factory. There were 800 employees, and overnight things change, right? So there's a
mm,
lot of things to consider as you move around the world for not only sourcing but also trading, doing your business. You mentioned the new administration coming in, the potential that tariffs will be applied to many different categories is the number one conversation I've been having with a number of clients recently. It's a scary, for those who source outside of the US, it's scary.
hmm.
And especially if you source from China. And
Right,
their customers are asking the question, what are you going to do? What are you going to do if and when tariffs get applied that are significant? And a lot of companies are saying, we're going to take it on the chin for a little while. We're not going to pass along the
mm,
tariffs because they're worried that somebody else will come in from another region that doesn't have tariffs and become the supplier, right? So definitely a lot of moving parts. Even if you don't go to those countries to sell your goods and services, if you're sourcing from those
right,
countries, it's a challenge
right,
for sure.
right. Even if it's materials that you're using to manufacture in the US, you're not just like importing and then selling, you're like
Right.
importing materials that still impacts the price
Hmm.
that your American customers are going to pay
Yep.
because some of those materials are subject to tariff and the price of manufacturing, the cost of goods sold just goes up.
Well,
But
and
I
there are
truly, yeah,
I was going to say there are manufacturing operations all along the Rio Grande, the border between Mexico and the U.S., that have been there for decades. And these are American companies, they're European companies, there are Asian companies that are producing right on the border with the US. And about 5 years ago, the Mexican government decided that it would be a really good idea to mandate a dramatic, like 40% increase in minimum wage on in border regions, so call them border counties or states. And so if you were in the interior of the country, your minimum wage didn't go up. But if you're right on the border of the US, your minimum wage went up 40%. And it's been going up every year. And that changes the economics as well. And that's not even a US imposed tariff system. That's a Mexico.
So what effect has that had? What downstream
Mostly,
effects?
so it shrinks your margins initially. It increases the price over time to the end user, and then it forces companies to make decisions about where they're going to manufacture. Do we move further into Mexico?
Does
Do
it make a
the country?
material difference in terms of those things? Does it
It
reduce the number
does.
of jobs? Does it close factories? I mean, like, is it I guess a material enough change that it makes a significant difference? I don't know anything about this.
Yeah, it definitely does. It
Mhm.
certainly increases the price to the end user in the short run. But it forces companies who have those manufacturing facilities right on the border to question whether or not they should stay there. Should they move to El Salvador? Should they move to Nicaragua? Should they move, elsewhere in Central America or South America? And a lot of
Mhm.
companies have done that. And there are manufacturing, call them office park or parks along the border between Mexico and the U.S. that have now experienced or are now experiencing significant vacancies because of it,
Mhm.
right? Like especially when
Yeah,
you're
with any
talking
of these
about
things, it's
television.
always it's a balance. People will always, if you do anything like raising minimum wage or anything that will increase costs, people will always say you're going to kill jobs, you're going to destroy the very people that you are hoping to help. But there's a certain amount of that that you could, they'll always say that, but there's a certain amount of that you probably can do, and it will be able to be swallowed. Like it'll be a manageable amount.
Yeah.
But then there's gonna, it sounds like they went maybe beyond that amount, and now they're, have, problems with vacancies. Then obviously there's jobs now that are lost.
Well,
Um,
and a lot of it depends on the industry. So if you're assembling televisions, it's probably not that difficult to move to another location to assemble televisions. But in the textiles business where you're sewing garments, it's not that easy to find sewers in other regions of the country that
mhm,
might have those same proficiencies. So in that business, we sucked it up. We just dealt with it. We found other ways to become more efficient, which actually did make us more efficient in the long run,
mhm.
as it forced us to innovate inside the supply chain,
All right.
which
Right,
benefited the company
robots.
overall. Robots would be interesting, yes.
Yeah, and no minimum wage, but super interesting, Pete. Thank you very much. I
Pleasure.
hope I hope you open. I know that you, excuse me, you open you open the eyes, open people's eyes to some of these factors when it comes to international expansion, 10xing a business, factors both culturally, operationally, importing, manufacturing, all different elements. Um, Hiring, a lot of different things that you enlightened us on. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And Ben, I'll leave you with two thoughts
Okay.
in terms of advice. That number one, we need to embrace humility. That can't you just can't go in thinking you have all the answers, and you've come from the top of the mountain and you're bringing them the answers. That's not going
Not
to
going to
help
work.
you in the long run. The second is to be super curious and learning about the culture and how things work. And as we do in our businesses in the US, we should be doing that when we seek to
Mhm.
to expand in other countries and other cultures. Um, and over the long haul, I think those two pieces of advice will pay off big time.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it, Pete. I appreciate you leaving us with that. If people want to learn more about Pete, the other COOs and people that help our clients, run and scale businesses on wolfsedgeintegrators.com. Thank you very much for making this time. And everybody else, will hopefully see you on the other side. Thank you.
You're listening to Win Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.